Hello and welcome to Access Asia, a special edition on climate change. Country after country reporting record temperatures, high levels of humidity and pollution only making matters worse. But the extreme heat also exposing extreme inequality. While scientists say climate change will make intense weather more common, we'll take a look at how governments and the people are trying to adapt. Parts of Asia have been hit by severe heat in recent weeks. An international coalition of scientists said it was a once-in-200-year event that would have been virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. Record-shattering temperatures seen in multiple countries, including Bangladesh, Vietnam, Singapore, and China. Jenny Shin has more.
Chasing shade under trees and jumping into the river, residents of Dhaka do what they can to cool down. Bangladesh has been in the grips of sweltering heat of about 40 degrees Celsius, making the population vulnerable to risks of dehydration, exhaustion, and heat strokes. The South Asian nation has shut thousands of schools as it struggles through its lengthiest heat wave in half a century, with the poor bearing the brunt. Like rickshaw pullers, for whom coping with the heat is a matter of livelihood.
I used to complete 20 or 30 trips a day before, but now that's been reduced to 10 or 15. The intense heat doesn't allow me to do any more than that. Plus, I can't get enough sleep because of the power cuts. There are 2 or 3 power cuts every night.
A surge in demand for air conditioners and fans has forced the country to cut power to millions of people. Further east in Vietnam, the heat wave has forced authorities to turn off streetlights and ration electricity as air conditioning demand threatened to overwhelm the power grid. Amid temperatures hovering around 40 degrees, the national weather forecaster warned of residential fire risks due to high power consumption. In neighboring China, temperatures soared to 37 degrees in the capital, with some residents finding shade under umbrellas and others fully covered from head to toe.
Normally, we go out in the early morning or afternoon. It's the hottest between 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. And we're afraid of getting a heat stroke. So we've prepared various medications at home, like ointment, traditional Chinese medicine, and herbal drinks for the heat.
After punishing heat waves struck large parts of the continent in April, temperatures spiked again in late May, normally the start of the cooler monsoon season. Experts warn that as many as 2 billion people will be exposed to dangerous heat if the world remains on its current track to rise an average of 2.7 degrees this century.
Asia accounts for the greatest proportion of the world's carbon emissions, but also its people are among the most vulnerable based on various environmental risks. For more, we can speak to Joseph Delat from the Asia program of the Parisian think tank Institut Montaigne. Hello, Joseph. Thank you for speaking to us. As we saw in that report,
Hello.
People are turning to air conditioners, but those are also part of the problem. What should they do when they're experiencing extreme heat like this?
Well, it's a very big concern for mainly the tropical region, because when you are actually above a certain level of temperature and of humidity, it becomes extremely complicated for the body to cool down if you don't have access to cooling facilities. So I would say that air conditioner is part of the problem, but may not be avoidable. And the issue as well is urbanization, because if you have like many air conditioner infrastructure in a very concrete like area, well, it creates more heat on the streets.
China is the world's biggest emitter, India the third biggest, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, all among the top dozen. On the whole, how have governments in this part of the world been trying to tackle climate change?
It really depends which country we are talking about. Developed nations like Japan have concrete carbon neutrality policy in place, trying to be carbon neutral from 2050. China, for instance, have a carbon neutrality target for 2060, so 10 years after the supposed target of the Paris Agreement, but still rely a lot on coal, and so which create air pollution and accelerate climate change. Well, China is also the biggest renewable energy power in the world. So it's very diverse. But if we go to Southeast Asia, which is the area the most affected by this heat wave at the moment, these are mostly emerging nations with actually historical emission not that high. So the way they are currently tackling climate change is actually more connected to how they are going to develop using renewable energy instead of coal, for instance.
Yeah, and have you noticed whether a certain form of government, whether it's a democracy or maybe a more authoritarian regime, is better than another at producing policy or outcomes?
Well, if you look at what China is doing, for instance, so a well-known autocracy, China is implementing certain policy to decrease emission, like carbon pricing, but not to the level they should implement in order to really decrease the emissions. So China is more focused on industrial policy, trying to shift their industrial policy to the green way, whereas in democracies like Japan have been a bit, especially in the region, late in implementing policies that are only now being really taken, like carbon pricing, for instance, or investment in green transition.
Some of the people most affected are poor or daily wage laborers, thinking street vendors, construction workers, drivers, and so on. A vital but often informal part of these societies. Do you expect the economies to be affected?
Oh yes, especially with extreme events like that. Because if you look at what governments, especially in Southeast Asia, have been implemented since the heat wave happened, most are recommendations saying, oh, you should stay indoor for 3 or 4 hours when it's the hottest hours of the day. But for the most vulnerable, it's actually impossible, because most of their work, their life earnings are coming from work outdoor. So it's actually very complicated for them to follow this recommendation. So at some point, the economic activity is going to decline, and it's already the case actually in Vietnam. I saw the number for economic activities in some cities have declined by 30 to 35% in the last 2 weeks, only because just people couldn't go and work outdoor which represents a huge chunk of the economy.
Any other ways we're seeing extreme weather expose inequalities?
Well, especially for health, I mean, if you have like extreme events like hot and humidity at the same time, it affects especially the most vulnerable people, like people with diabetes, people elderly, for instance. And if you do not have access to cooling facilities or even a hospital very close or nearby, if it's too expensive for you, then it affects the capacity of these people to actually heal.
All right, Joseph, stay with us. We're going to turn our attention to India real quick. A 2021 study by top meteorologists found that heat waves have claimed more than 17,000 lives over 50 years in the country. The situation only getting worse as India is one of the most affected nations by climate change. Cami Knight looks at the impact on farmers in the south of the country.
The valley of Nashik in the south of India is known as the capital of grapes. And farmers like Sachin have been forced to find ways to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
Thanks to this sensor, I have information on the weather, the strength of the wind, the state of the ground. It also measures the humidity level of the farm. This is very important because it allows me to know exactly how to irrigate.
A farmer in India owns on average less than 2 hectares of land, often practices monoculture and lives below the poverty line. Though it may only represent 18% of the country's GDP, the agricultural sector employs 43% of the working population. Unreliable resources mean cooperation is key. This collective near Sachin's farm brings together 18,000 farmers, of which a third are shareholders. Meanwhile, research is underway to adapt to an increasingly difficult climate.
In the normal world, we leave it for 45 days to mature completely and take that seed and we can germinate it. We can get a plant out of that. But here, to reduce the time, I'm harvesting it 20 days into the development, and I can germinate that seed and get the plant again and plant it again. We are giving limited food, limited water, and limited light. That's all the trick.
Initiatives like these are becoming increasingly necessary in a country like India. Between 2016 and 2021, 36 million hectares of agricultural land were destroyed by natural disasters.
Joseph, are initiatives like the one in that report born out of bad government policy, or more just ingenuity from the people themselves?
Well, that's more ingenuity for the people themselves. You have different kind of adaptation. The issue is how to actually have good adaptation and not maladaptation. For some initiative at the local level are actually more fruitful than what the one decided at the national level, especially for a country like India, which is a very big country with different kind of climate and different kind of culture. So I would say that the biggest issue India faces at the moment is to find the necessary finance both to develop and to adapt to climate change.
And Joseph, the war in Ukraine, we've seen it create food scarcity issues, also rising energy prices around the world. How have the knock-on effects been felt in Asia?
Well, energy prices have actually changed quite a lot. How Asian countries, and particularly Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, are actually generating electricity because the price of LNG has been increased. Because the Europe has actually become a customer for LNG, these countries actually decided to switch back to coal usage. So they have increased their emissions because of the war in Ukraine, because they couldn't actually afford to buy LNG on the global market. So for the COP28 in Dubai, I think that is going still to be an issue. So last year we saw at COP27 that actually Ukraine was an issue, but this year we will see that oil-producing country, actually not so far from the region affected at the moment, will have to actually deal with the impact of both the war and the growing heat wave, growing natural disaster induced by climate change.
All right, Joseph, thank you very much. Joseph Delat from the Institut Montaigne. That brings us to the end of this special edition of Access Asia. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.